every business is in competition with other people trying to deliver the same thing. So the first thing to understand is that's the truth. And if you're not competing against anyone, then you should probably get out of that business, because you're either going to make it absolutely massive, like Uber, you're like a Silicon Valley type startup, or there isn't a need. So that's the first thing. Then the second thing is understanding who you're competing against, and then have a rational reason why you think you can outcompete them. I say rational because we like to convince ourselves of things that aren't true, especially when it comes to business. So there has to be a reason why you could be better than other people that you're competing against in order for this to potentially produce some kind of profit.
Before we start the show, I have a quick question for you. Is your resume stuck in the rejection pile? At Resume Assassin, I create powerful resumes that showcase your skills, experience, and achievements, getting you noticed by recruiters. I'll also optimize your LinkedIn profile, transforming it into a magnet for opportunity. Visit resumeassassin.com today and take charge of your job search. Visit resumeassassin.com. Welcome to Resume Assassin Presents Recruiting Insider, where I create a safe space to have candid conversations with recruiters and LinkedIn thought leaders. This podcast promises to inform, entertain, and inspire. Tom Hunt, welcome to Recruiting Insider.
It is an absolute pleasure to be here.
I'm excited to have you. I was attracted to Tom's LinkedIn profile almost immediately. And I'm not alone, because he has over 91,000 engaged followers. His posts are, literally amazing. And he really has a way with storytelling that draws me in and makes me want to engage with him. And he also has an interesting story to tell, both in his personal life and his professional life. And today he's here to do just that. Tom started in the corporate world in management consulting. A few life circumstances made him rethink his corporate career and jump into entrepreneurship. More than a decade later, he has tried and failed 17 businesses, invested in 11, and he says that he's learned a lot along the way. So Tom, could you tell us just a little bit more about your journey from the corporate world into entrepreneurship?
Yeah, great research. A really good summary. Maybe I'll steal that.
It's all yours.
I think the interesting part is I didn't really know what I was doing in my life until I tried out a few things. So I studied chemistry at uni, and then in the final project, you spend 6 months in a lab basically on your own, doing really detailed work. So and that's great for some people, but not for me at all. So then I was like, I need to do something with people. So I was I sent 60 applications to big companies to go and work, and finally got accepted to one, which was Ernst & Young. And so then I did that for 2 years. It was a bit boring. Didn't really like the work that much. Didn't like the corporate stuff. So I was like, I know I'm going to move to Accenture, get paid more, and do slightly more exciting work. So I did that. And then 6 months in, I was slightly better pay, slightly better work, but still think it's pretty rubbish. So this gets us to 2014, where I basically decided at the start of the year that I want to replace my salary with a business I've created myself so that I can leave. And so that was 2014, was doing the Accenture job and trying to build a company. And I'm happy to say I managed to just about achieve that goal, and I left. And then from 2015 to today, 2015 to 2019, I tried so many different things, mostly all failed. And then it was 2019 that I finally started with one that seems to be working to this day. So that's the summary of the journey.
Wonderful. And we'll dig into what you do now, at Fame and that success story. But I want to start with talking about just some of those failures. You said that you started 17 businesses, and it sounds like you had more failures than success, which is pretty common, and I can totally relate to that, and I think there are probably a lot of listeners out there too that feel the same way as you, where it's I have all of these skills, maybe they're in the corporate world and they either want to take their life in a different direction or their career in a different direction, whether it's another place in the corporate world or even stepping into the entrepreneurial space like you did. So with those 17 businesses that you started, could you tell us a little bit more about those and why do you think they failed?
Yeah, let's go through a couple and I'll explain like the situation and then let's see if you can guess why it didn't work. It should
All
be
right.
obvious.
All right.
So a big highlight was a male leggings company. So me and my two best friends decide one day that like jeans are getting, in England anyway, in 2014, were getting like skinnier and skinnier. And so we were like, the next iteration of this has to be leggings, but for men.
Yeah.
And so we called them Meggings. We bought the domain meggings.com. And then we essentially found someone in China to make them and started selling them online. We have some initial success really because of the remarkability of the idea. We go on Dragon's Den, which is like Shark Tank for the people in the US. Pitch, didn't get any money, but we sold quite a lot of leggings. But with this backdrop, I'm bearing in mind that none of me and my two best friends had any experience in like fashion, manufacturing, or marketing D2C. Can you try to guess like what went wrong with the company?
I would imagine that you just couldn't convince men that leggings are awesome. Women already know it, but men probably are a little bit self-conscious, I would imagine, in being sold leggings.
Definitely a barrier. Definitely
Yeah.
a barrier. So, but the main barrier I think was that we actually, or it would have survived for longer if we actually were able to build a good product.
Yeah.
So none of us had any fashion experience or manufacturing experience. So actually the leggings, I think we got lucky. We found a relatively good supplier, but they weren't that good.
Yeah.
So that was why I'm wrong with that one. So that's a good learning,
Number one.
right? So
Yep.
the next one, and this is like kicking myself a little bit for this one. And this is actually the one that I left the corporate world with. So some backdrop in EY and Accenture, I was kind of involved in like big outsourcing projects. And so my idea to be able to leave the corporate world was to build a team in the Philippines and then sell that team to people, to startups in London, like offshore labor, which right now is like a very sexy like business model. And there are big, fast growth businesses that are doing this really well. So I start that. It replaces the salary. Some issues with like client delivery, but that's like natural in any business, right? But I didn't know that at the time. And so as those issues were happening, I was listening and reading books from like Silicon Valley people, and they are preaching that businesses need to be scalable, right? And so I'm like, this service business isn't going to scale to 1 billion. So if not an opportunity, I should pursue, which is obviously completely idiotic. And so then I pivoted to like building an Upwork clone, which is like a online marketplace just for Filipino virtual assistants, which again, like feasible business, but I'm me with my like $20,000 are competing against Upwork, which have $1 billion, you know, and so it's just pretty stupid. So the lesson there is that every business is kind of hard, and so when you get the issues, you really have to think if the issues are terminal. In the case with that service company, they weren't terminal, I don't think. And then B, just understand like who you're competing with, and try to compete with people that are not like super intelligent and have massive amounts of cash.
Yeah, because if you try to go up against those companies that have billions of dollars, you stand absolutely no chance. I mean, from a creative perspective, from a time perspective, from a development perspective, there's just no way that you can keep up with that. That's an important lesson to learn.
Exactly right. So that's like 2 or 3 lessons from the failed companies.
Okay. So many of our listeners, I mean, they're probably many aspiring entrepreneurs, right? Or side hustlers even. What advice would you give to someone who's trying to grow a successful business right now?
I think we can go back to the competition point. Like every business is in competition with other people trying to deliver the same thing. So the first thing to understand is that's the truth. And if you're not competing against anyone, then you should probably get out of that business, because you're either going to make it absolutely massive like Uber, you're like a Silicon Valley type startup, or there isn't a need. So that's the first thing. Then the second thing is understanding who you're competing against, and then have a rational reason why you think you can outcompete them. I say rational because we like to convince ourselves of things that aren't true. especially when it comes to business. So there has to be a reason why you could be better than other people that you're competing against in order for this to potentially produce some kind of profit.
Yeah, absolutely. Better, or I would even argue just slightly different. I was actually listening to a podcast on drop shipping a couple of days ago, and I thought it was really interesting because their business model was finding these products that were super successful and then making them better in some way, whether it was just offering a different color or providing more details about the product or just doing something to go above and beyond a little bit more than what their competitors are doing to really stand out and differentiate themselves from their competitors and the competition out there.
Totally agree. Now, the second, once we understand that, the second point I would lay on, I think it's like a fundamental belief that any aspiring entrepreneur should have, which is retention is the foundation of growth. Yeah. Now, again, it's quite sexy to find loads of customers, but then delivering and actually adding ideally more value than they're paying you is the hard part and the boring part. But that's also the way that you grow, in my opinion. Because if you're able to over deliver, especially for the early customers, then A, they're retained, so they'll pay you more over the long term. But B, they'll bring you more through word of mouth and referrals. And so the analogy I like to use here is the leaky bucket. When you're starting, so important to ensure that the bucket has only maybe tiny holes, not loads of holes. Because that's just going to make it much easier and much more profitable to grow.
It's all about the customer, right? I mean, and I totally agree, whether it's a product or a service, you want to make sure that your customer, you over exceed their expectations. Because if you don't do that, they're not going to come back. They're not going to tell other people about you. You know, I'm a big advocate of creating customers as advocates so that they can go out and tell other people about your business and start to spread the word. So, creating those customer advocates is so darn important. And in the end, that's where the money comes from, is the customer. So if they're not satisfied, you probably don't have a viable business idea at all. Whether it's a product or a service that you provide, I think that the same goes.
Totally agree. I think it's Alex Hormozy that talks about these 3 lines that you can use to describe any business. So the bottom line is the cost, which is how much it costs you to deliver the product or service. The middle line is the price, so how much the customer's paying. And then ideally the line at the top is the value, right? Yeah. And so then the difference between the cost and the price line, which should be the bottom 2 lines, is your margin. And then the difference between the value and the price line is your growth rate, right? So if your value is actually below price, you're probably not going to get word of mouth, right? So you're not going to grow. Yeah. But if your value is significantly higher than price, then that's the extra happiness the customer is getting. So they're more likely to stay and then refer. And so I really like to think about those 3 lines. And you may actually want to bring your price line down, reduces margin, but should increase the growth rate.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great strategy. So you mentioned in 2019, you started the company that you're at now, Fame. Fame starts and grows the world's most profitable B2B podcast. And you've worked with a lot of huge clients like Workday, Zendesk, Ramp, Circle, Lean Data, Signify, People.ai, and a ton more. And you currently have 70 full-time remote employees. And according to your LinkedIn profile, you've bootstrapped this business from 0 to 3.6 million in ARR. How did you come up with this idea? And could you tell us a little bit about your company and what you guys actually do?
Sure. So, we had the time period between 2015 and 2019 where I was trying and failing a lot. Yeah. There was one point where I was failing so much that the cash reserves were running out. So I took a job at a company actually that I invested in as head of demand generation, B2B SaaS company. I joined, quickly realized that I wasn't great at being employed. I thought maybe something had changed in the 5 years previous, but no. However, one thing that we did that worked out quite well is when you join any business as a marketing person, you're scanning, you're reviewing the customer personas and deciding if there's any you should focus more on one or create a new one, for example. There was one customer persona that existed that I thought we should focus on more. So we sold sales software, and this person was the sales operations person. And so I actually, to learn about these people, I tried to DM them on LinkedIn to see if they'd jump on a call with me so I could learn about them. Obviously, I just got ignored. And so then the master stroke was creating Sales Ops Demystified, which was the name of the podcast, where I'd interview these people. And all of a sudden, we had these ideal that turned out to be good customer personas, like coming into our office to be interviewed. Learning a shed load about these people. We were getting some downloads, like not massive amounts. The guests were like sharing the stuff on LinkedIn. So the business was like generally happy with the podcast. And then guest 11 was the VP of Sales Ops at Intercom, which is a relatively big SaaS company. He actually got chatting with our CEO randomly after the interview, and then 6 months later bought our software for the whole of Intercom sales team. So a big chunky deal, like paid for the podcast 9 times over. And so now my employer is like super happy with the podcast, right? So as this podcast is absolutely crushing it, I'm starting to realize that actually I probably shouldn't be employed. So I leave, and then credit to that company, they agreed to be the first client of Fame. And there's also one guy called Clay who lives in the Philippines that I've worked with for a while, who within my marketing team, but then comes with me to Fame. And then we start delivering this podcast service to my old employer, and then slowly to other companies that we're able to sell to.
Wow. I mean, kudos to your old employer for, coming on and sticking with you and becoming that first client of yours, and winning that first client is huge. So that's an amazing win right off the bat. Yeah.
Going back to the retention of the foundation of growth thing, I'm happy to say that business is still a client today, 4.5 years later.
Wow.
Now, for aspiring entrepreneurs, I actually think this is a really good way to start a company, like a very de-risked way of starting a company, is in your job, get really good at doing a specific thing.
Yeah.
And then essentially, if you want to take the leap, like you can tell your company that you're going freelance to do that specific thing. Would they like to be an early customer? You can give them a discount. And from the company's perspective, it actually has pretty good optics for them to say that you're leaving, especially if you're like well regarded in the organization, to say you're leaving, but you're staying on as freelance to do this thing. That's actually much better optics for the company, because otherwise it's like, this person's leaving, why are they leaving? It looks bad. And so then you have your first client, and then you can simply copy and paste the thing you're doing, document it, and deliver it for other customers. So I think it's a super good way of starting a B2B service company. And then once you have that service up and running, maybe you can build some software in the future. But this is a really good way to become an entrepreneur, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's great advice. Like you said, become an expert in one specific area, get to know everything about that specific area. And so if you do leave and your employer doesn't want to come along, you still have this really valuable expertise or set of skills that you can take to other employers and eventually build up that business.
Exactly right.
Yeah. So I want to break it down just a little bit more. So what are just a few of the steps that you took to really grow your company from that one client to what it is now with that 3.6 million in ARR?
So the first thing is really not sexy. It's like the boring thing, which is trying to make clients happy. So I'll just give a couple of things we do for that. We have 4 values in the company. The first one, we call it client, client, client. Essentially what that means is that if anybody in the business does something or has a decision to make and they choose the route which is better for the client, then they're probably not going to get in trouble. That's how I explain it to people in the company. So that's how we're able to have this ethos bleed into everybody within the business. So that's one thing. Second thing is we track happiness scores. So after every meeting we have with a client, we give them a happiness score between 0 and 3. And then we average that out and average that for each account manager and each account director, etc., and tracking that every week. And then probably the next most impactful thing is we have what we call magic moments. So for every customer that comes in, there are 7 magic moments that we know if we hit those things within a time period, they're probably not going to leave. They're probably going to be happy. And so then it's the account manager's job to essentially ensure they hit those magic moments. So I would say, again, it's not boring. Sorry, it's not like exciting, but that's the number one thing. Now let's try and do some more exciting stuff. I think that if the thing you're offering has existing demand, like it's not a new crazy innovative thing that no one's searching for, then I think Google is probably the best place to start, because the lead or the prospect already has intent. So the job of convincing them to do a thing has already been taken care of, and you just have to convince them to choose you. And so that's probably worked, especially in the early days, worked best for us, because we didn't really have the resources because we were bootstrapped, to invest heavily in the sales process and these massive long sales cycles trying to convince someone to do something. But if they're coming from Google, whether that's paid or organic, then they're already going to do it, probably, if you get the keywords right. So you have to have high intent keywords, e.g. someone searches for B2B podcast agency. They probably decided they're going to do a podcast, and they probably decided they're going to do it with an agency. And so then there's only one thing we have to convince them of. So I think, especially if you're not experienced in sales or marketing in the early days, try to make your life easier by focusing your efforts on people that already have intent to do the thing. So that's the second point. Mm-hmm. Third point I think is super interesting, much easier for software companies, but still possible for service companies, is what I like to call service-led growth. It's called product-led growth in the software world. But the question here is, how can you have your customers expose your brand to other people in the process of them receiving your service? Mm-hmm. If we can do that, then there's some kind of virality that occurs with everybody that comes into your business. And so if you grow, you're actually going to be getting more exposure, and that hopefully will reduce customer acquisition cost. And so just to explain this for us, we Start and Grow B2B podcast. And one thing we do is, in the show notes of every episode that's released, we say this episode has been handcrafted by the team over at fame.so, and we add the link. And so maybe in an average month, there might be 90 to 100 episodes that go out into the world with that link in. And so that helps. There are probably other ways to do this depending on what service you're providing to your clients, but I think that's something to try and embed early on in the process.
That's amazing. I mean, so number one, think about your customer, right? Make sure that you're setting that bar a little bit lower than what you're delivering. Make sure that the customer is completely satisfied, and then figure out the demand. If you know that somebody wants your product or service, like Tom said, focus your efforts on those people that have intent, and that'll make your job a whole lot easier, especially like you said, if you're bootstrapping a company, you don't have a huge sales and marketing budget. Just knowing that the demand's there, and then figuring out how to differentiate yourself and show them why they should choose you is so critical. And I love that concept of product-led growth or service-led growth. And again, it kind of goes back to creating customers that are brand advocates. And I'm a big believer in that, because, if you can figure out a way to have your customers shout your brand, your company, your product from the rooftops, that's going to be so much more valuable than even pouring, $100 or hundreds of thousands of dollars in sales and marketing, because then people know that, hey, this person that I trust has had this really great experience with this company, this person, this service, this product. I'm going to give it a shot. I need this product. I need somebody to produce a B2B podcast for me. I'm going to go to Tom and his team, because I know that he's done it for this guy, and they're super happy and successful in doing it. So I think that those are amazing tips there, Tom. And what are your top 3 lessons that you've learned from the success of Fame? We've already kind of talked about, your top lessons from some of your failures, but what are those top 3 lessons from the success?
I think I would say it always comes back to retention. So retention's financial growth is like the number one thing I've learned with Fame. But other things are, I think, focus. I think one of the reasons why it's worked relatively well is that we've only done one thing, and we actually started iterating on that one thing before Fame even existed, when I was working for my employer. That's the other benefit of this method, is you're basically learning how to deliver a service when you're being paid a salary. So it's probably been like 5 years we've been iterating on that process, and so that enables us to, or increases the chance that we're able to deliver a service that is cheaper and the same or better than our competitors because we've just have 5 years of R&D basically. So retention, focus. Then I think the final point I've been thinking about recently, one way of looking at your job as the founder or CEO of a company is you're really just managing agreements with 3 to 4 different stakeholders. So it's the shareholders, which if you're bootstrapped and solo founder, then it's just you. But it's still important to think of yourself as a stakeholder. Your customers, your team, or employees, and your partners. And so if you maybe make something a little bit better for one partner, let's say you give everybody a pay rise, and you don't increase prices, so the customers that are not unhappy, then the shareholders, it slightly reduce the deal for them, because there's less profit. Yeah. And so just having an understanding of whenever you change something in the system, it's probably going to have some impact on other shareholders. And so just understanding that and understanding that if you do something here, you might have to do something there in order to keep the system in balance. It's quite a nuanced, not tangible point there, but it's something I've been thinking about recently. And so if anybody, maybe it's more relevant when you're slightly bigger as a company and you have more stakeholders in those groups. But I think that's an interesting thing to consider.
Absolutely. There are a ton of moving parts when you get to that level, I would imagine. So in your podcast, Confessions of a B2B Entrepreneur, you said that you're nearly the number one business in this space, in the B2B podcasting space, which is absolutely incredible. And in your words, in order to do that, you need to become known, liked, and trusted. I completely agree with this. So what exactly have you done to become known, liked, and trusted?
I think the short way of saying this is basically create information that either educates or entertains so that when the B2B buyer comes into the buying window, which is maybe like 3% of the time they spend at work, then you're the person they come to. So that's the whole theory behind fame. How you actually do that, I think, is on 3 levels. At the top, we have social. This is the most fleeting, like you have the lightest or lowest intensity relationships, but it's the easiest one to grow if you get to leverage the algorithms correctly. Then I think it flows down to email, and then podcasts sit at the bottom, in my opinion, where we get the most intense relationship because you're in someone's ears every week. But it's actually the hardest to grow, low discoverability. And so for what I've been doing with Fame recently is I've had the podcast for 4 years. So we've had this bottom of the funnel thing, which it is working. I put ads for Fame in my podcast. It does work to drive customers. But instead of investing too much time in the growth of that, I've actually more recently been focused on the top level, which is social. So I've been basically took LinkedIn from like 27,000 to 90,000 followers in like 2-3 months. So that's working quite well. Now, the caveat there is the stuff I'm talking about isn't really the stuff that is interesting to Fame customers, but that's a separate episode. And then I'm kind of skipping the email thing, but the email thing will come in the future. And so my strategy basically in the last 6 months has been, instead of focusing effort on growing the podcast, keep the podcast running, make the episodes better and better, but then invest the mind energy of growth into the top where there's potentially higher leverage.
Yeah, and I know that, you mentioned with your LinkedIn profile, that could be a whole nother episode, and I totally agree, but I think I'd be remiss if I didn't ask just a couple of questions about your LinkedIn presence, because I do think that that's incredibly powerful, and you've built an amazing personal brand on there, like I've already said. What are some of your secrets?
Let's do 3. So it only really started blowing up when I started engaging with other people. So I spend maybe half an hour a day just like going through people's I have like bookmarks saved to people's profiles that I know I like their content. I'll go through those and I'll leave like authentic comments, but then I'll also just scroll the feeds, so there's like random stuff as well. So I think that is crucial. Like if you want to get more engagement, then you have to give it first. So that's the first step. The second step, I think, is that I actually was posting for like 3 years and never really got more than 100 likes on a post. But what that did is that I had like if I was posting, let's say 3-5 times a week for 3 years, like 2,000 posts, maybe 1,000 with like practice. And so if you read like one of my story posts now and it's like quite silky smooth, I'm bigging myself up, and it's probably only because I've done 1,000 of them, Yeah. So I think copywriting practice is the second point.
Yeah.
The third point, which I think is perhaps the most impactful, is that if you want to grow the LinkedIn audience, you have to consistently release posts that perform. And so if you release one post and you get it wrong, like you put a link in there or it's just rubbish and you get like 5 likes, then that's going to mess up your reputation with the algorithm. Not irreversibly, obviously, but you just want to have wins consistently. Yeah. This is how you grow fast. And so one way you can mitigate the risk of not having wins, or another way of saying that, increase the chances of getting posts that consistently get engaged, is by researching other content that has worked previously. Now you can't copy, you get in trouble for that, and it also looks bad, but you can take a concept or an idea, add your own flair, and then use that, because that concept has already been proven to get engagement. So I think that's something that, if you get it right, can have the biggest impact. So we're engaging, we are being consistent and training ourselves and getting better and better at writing. And then we're also reducing risk by posting about stuff that has proven to engage. I think those are the 3 biggest learnings.
Yeah, and I think that that's so important because of course, it's a super digital world, and there are a lot of people that should be or are trying to build a personal brand, whether it's to build up their personal brand to land that next career, or whether it's to attract clients and step out into the entrepreneurial space. There's no getting around it. I mean, social media is important, and especially LinkedIn in both of those spaces, whether you're trying to better yourself in your career or in your company. So those are amazing tips. And I love that you said, you commented, if you can post for years and years and years, but if you're not engaging with other people's posts, you're probably not going to get very far, because other people aren't going to want to engage with your posts if you're not taking the time and the effort to engage with their posts. And especially in an authentic way, not just saying 1 or 2 words, but actually providing actual value if you're going to take the time to engage with those posts. And so I think that's something that really resonates with me, and a conversation that I've been having with a lot of people lately as well.
Nice.
Yeah. So what are you working on at the moment, Tom, and where can we find you online?
So yeah, the only business I have is fame.so, is the domain. And then, LinkedIn is where I am the most active. And then also been experimenting with Twitter. So it's Tom Hunt, basically. If you search on LinkedIn or Twitter, you'll find me. And also happy to answer any questions. If people just want to email me, tom@fame.so, with questions about LinkedIn or business, etc., then I'm happy to answer.
Thanks for coming on today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Mary.
Thanks for listening. I will be releasing episodes every Monday, so be sure to subscribe on the platform that you are watching this, give it a 5-star review, and we'll see you next time.